Okay, final lecture. Um, been sort of an odd class. I hope it's been okay. Uh, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of this online thing still, but I don't know. Felt like we tried to make the best of it. Um, all right, eschatology, end times. How should we think about these various issues? I think the most, at least for me, at least the most important question here is personal eschatology. Personal eschatology is the question of what happens to people when they die. So, um, I remember having my grandfather die and having my kids ask me, where did great grandfather go, right? That's this question. So, three different ways the Christians have thought about this. The first step view I call a one-step view, and that is people who die go directly to be judged. So the moment my grandfather dies, he's standing before Jesus, great white throne. That's judgment day for him. And then he's judged and then goes to his final destination. So the implication of this is that my grandfather is currently in heaven. He was a lifelong believer in Jesus Christ. So he's currently in heaven. Now, why would you believe this? There are a couple of passages, and maybe the most powerful of which is Jesus' words to the criminal on the cross in Luke 23. It says the criminal kind of acknowledges Christ's lordship, acknowledges who he is, and he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Right? So there you go. Simple, right? Well, there are some problems with this, and there's some reasons why people have pushed back on this. Right? The first question is, today you'll be with me in paradise. Where does it say that Jesus went after he died? Actually, it doesn't suggest that Jesus was in heaven. And, two things, in this respect. The first is the number of places in Scripture it says that Jesus descended into Hades, the place of the dead, did not descend into hell. Like our understanding of hell is the Greek word Gehenna, right, where the eternal punishment place for people who reject Jesus Christ, who are separated from God, right? What Scripture, the Greek word, Jesus descended into Hades, which is the place of the dead, right? The other thing is that when Jesus was resurrected, Mary saw him and recognized him, and Jesus says, "Do not grab onto me. I have not yet ascended to the Father," which says about as clear as you can get that Jesus was not in heaven in those 3 days, right? So then how do we, so that's a problem for the language of the one-step view. The other problem with the one-step view is that it suggests that that Scripture strongly suggests there's a corporate final judgment in the end times. So end times, God wraps everything all up, all are resurrected, and then all at that time stand judgment or are in judgment day for all people. It'd be a little weird if, on the one-step view, my grandfather died, went to judgment day, went to heaven, and then end times, however many years later, right, was resurrected and then had another judgment day. It seems redundant, to say the least. So the problems with the one-step view have led a couple different ways people have dealt with that. First is what they've said is it's an eventual one-step view. It's not an immediate one-step view, right? There's only one step, right? But what you have is when people die, they wait for judgment. And so the way this is commonly talked about is what's called soul sleep. So my grandfather sort of blinks out of awareness or existence or something, and then it may be 2,000 years, but it's going to seem like just immediately that from the time he died, from his perspective, from the time he died to when he's standing before God in the great white throne, judgment day, it's going to seem like no time at all. So this would have to, Jesus' word to the criminal on the cross would have to be, it's going to seem like today that you're with me in paradise, right? So that's one way of doing this. The other way to do this is to acknowledge a two-step view. And that is that just the idea that there's an intermediate realm. So when people die, they go to a place to wait for final judgment, for God to wrap all these things up. Now, two different examples, two different ways of making sense of this thing. The first is the notion of purgatory, which is a Roman Catholic doctrine. So that's the Roman Catholics believe in purgatory, and that's this intermediate realm. But it's only for believers who have a sin debt. They kind of need to work off some of their sins. But that's an example of an intermediate realm. Probably a better way, you wouldn't have to go with the Roman Catholic understanding of righteousness, is to just understand that when people die, where do they go? They go to Hades, or in the Hebrew, Sheol. And that means just literally the place of the dead, a place where people are waiting the final resurrection. So, and what's more, there's even some language around, Sheol in Psalm 139. Sheol is referred to as a place where God's presence is, right? So you could understand this as a place you go to be in God's presence, even though it's not as full and complete of presence as when we're going to be in heaven. All right, so that's personal eschatology, but there's also general eschatology. General eschatology is what happens to all of creation. And the key question here is, how should end times texts in Scripture be understood? So texts like Matthew 24 and 25 and 1 Thessalonians 4 and into 5, certainly the book of Revelation. How should these texts be understood? The first example is what's called the idealist view, right? Or the first view on this. On the idealist view, these texts are allegories. They're not meant to be taken literally. They're about ongoing spiritual warfare. So these end times texts are analogies or allegories of how throughout the Christian history we're going to have various spiritual battles that we need to fight. The second view is the most common within evangelicalism, and if you've read the Left Behind novels, that's the view represented here in that book. The futurist view says all these end times texts are prophecies. They refer to future historical events, future from our perspective. So there's going to be a future tribulation, there's going to be a future millennium, and all of these sorts of things. So these texts are prophecies. The third view is to say that they are some history and some prophecy. Actually, mostly history, but there still is a little bit of prophecy. So the stuff that's past is the stuff that's tribulation stuff. So the language in Scripture that refers to the bowls of wrath being poured out, and all the stuff that we have taken to refer to future tribulation events. The preterist says, no, that's describing past events, past even from the perspective of the writer, even from the perspective of John writing the book of Revelation. Those are events that were in his past. That is, they refer to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, right? So on this view, the book of Revelation is this book that says, we've just gone through this terribly difficult time. Don't worry, God wins in the end. Right? And then that's the prophecy, the language about heaven, the language about second coming. That's the stuff that's in the future. So the preterist says a lot of the end times text that people are trying to figure out, ooh, that's all in the future. No, they're history. There is a little bit of prophecy, a little bit of stuff that's still future, but again, that's second coming and heaven. Okay, so how about the millennium and the tribulation debates? Right? So what is the millennium? What is the tribulation? Again, crucially important that we see that this is an intramural debate between futurists, right? Because whether you're an idealist or whether you're a preterist, all these specific debates about when is the millennium and when is the tribulation, what's the tribulation going to look like, those all go away, right? So if you're a futurist, that you believe these things are still happening, then these traditional questions are hotly debated. So what is meant by the millennium? The millennium is a future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, described primarily in Revelation 20. And the tribulation is a future 7-year period of really bad stuff. So earthquakes and terrible pandemics. Here we go. No, it's not the end times. Pretty sure. So all these really, really bad, this 7-year period of just terrible, terrible stuff. All right. So what are 3 different views, again, all from within a futurist perspective? What are the 3 different ways futurists could think about the millennium and the tribulation? The first view here is called a post-millennial view. The post-millennial view is really common in the late 1800s and early part of the 1900s. And what it envisioned was you had the millennium first, and then Jesus coming back, and then heaven. Now you might say, well, how do you have the millennium first? The idea is the church initiates the millennium. So there was this belief in the late 1800s that society was becoming more and more and more Christian. It was going to come to the place where the church would just sort of take over the world, right? And that Christ would reign on earth through the church, right? The optimism of this view was largely killed by World War I. And whatever optimism was still around was killed by World War II. So there are very few post-millennialists running around these days. Second view is called the amillennial view. The amillennial view, just like an atheist is one that doesn't believe in theism, the amillennialist doesn't believe in the millennium. That is, all you have is someday Jesus is going to come back, and then we will be in heaven. So then what do you do with the text in Revelation 20 on this view? The millennium is just a metaphor for heaven. Now you might say, well, why is it referred to as 1,000 years? You have to understand that 1,000 years as like code for forever. Like sometimes we use really big numbers for, heaven's going to be like 1,000,000 years, right? Or it's, sometimes we use really large numbers as code for just massive amounts, right? For just forever. Third view is called the premillennial view. This is, again, the most common view within conservative Christianity, right? And the order here is you have a second coming, and then when Jesus returns, he creates the millennium, 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, and then at the end of that, we all go to heaven. Now, you might ask, where is the tribulation in all this? The tribulation debates are, again, kind of an intramural debate within premillennialism. So there's 2 different ways that premillennials can think about the tribulation. Actually, more than 2, but 2 that I'm going to talk about. The first is what's called the variation of premillennialism is called historic premillennialism, and this understands the tribulation as being a post-tribulational view. The post means that believers are on earth during the tribulation, right? So the second coming comes after, post the tribulation. The second variety of premillennial is called the dispensational premillennial view. This is the pre-tribulational view. So Christ comes before the millennium, before the tribulation, and raptures Christians away, and so we don't experience the tribulation. The whole language of rapture fits with this dispensational premillennial view, right? And so, 2 people are walking down the road, and one is raptured and taken away, and that is this pre-tribulational understanding where some of the Christians just disappear and the non-Christians are left to go through the tribulation. Probably one of the most difficult questions within Christian theology is the question of hell. And both how do we understand it and what it looks like, and just trying to wrap our head around it. C.S. Lewis said, "There is no doctrine I would more willingly remove from Christianity than the doctrine of hell." And I'm with him on that. Unfortunately, it's C.S. Lewis, neither C.S. Lewis nor me can do that, and so it's in Scripture. It's something we have to talk about, right? So why does hell exist? Here, this breaks down along Calvinist and Arminian lines, right? Arminians say that hell exists because God created human beings with free will. Some humans use their free will to reject God, and so hell is a place for people who reject God. Calvinists, again, with meticulous providence, God, unconditional election, irresistible grace. He could have ordained that everybody be saved, but he chose not to, so he could demonstrate his glory, right? Not only through his love and mercy lavished on the elect, but through his punishment, through his wrath, through his justice lavished on those he did not elect to be saved. All right, so what does hell actually look like? What is the phenomenology of hell? What people who go to hell, what do they experience? 4 different views here. The first is boringly, but sort of aptly titled the traditional view. That is that hell is eternal, lasts forever. It's physically painful. Physically painful meaning like the language around fire and stuff, that's literal. So it's a physically painful, torturing, retributive punishment. So retributive meaning that these people have committed the ultimate sin of rejecting God, and so God, that is a punishment that is just because of the sin that they have committed. The second view, my title for this is the tragic refuge view, but it's probably more commonly known as C.S. Lewis's view on hell. And on this view, hell is still eternal, it's ongoing. It is painful, although not necessary, it's not physically painful. So the language of fire and burning is not literal. By the way, even John Calvin didn't believe that the fire and burning was literal. Think about it. If humans are, souls, right? How do you burn a soul? Or if people are given glorified bodies, how do you, when those bodies be burned up by the fire, right? So there's all sorts of interesting questions there. But Lewis argues that the pain here, that there is genuine pain, but it's not physical pain. Rather, the pain is from our self-imposed separation from God. So we were created to be in relationship with God. Some people reject that. And in rejecting God, we kind of are left with the emptiness of our life. So C.S. Lewis talks about hell as being a place, not like a jail where the door is locked on the outside and we throw people in, lock the door and throw away the key. But it's a refuge, right? Where the door is locked on the inside to keep God out, right? So as his final act of his love, God says, I will give you a place where I will no longer go. You can be separate from me, right? So those who are in hell are those who have chosen to be in hell, right? It's still painful because they are all they get, right? They're their own gods, and they're left with all their addictions and dysfunctions and all these things. So it's a refuge, but it's a tragic refuge. People are genuinely suffering in hell, but it's self-imposed. The third view is called annihilationism. That is, the people who go to hell are destroyed. They cease to be, right? The language of Scripture, there's quite a bit of reference to destruction in Scripture, that people who that hell is a place of destruction, right? So annihilationists argue that that's what hell is, that people are destroyed, right? And the final view is called universalism. I personally would love to believe this view. It's hard to reconcile with Scripture. The idea here is that people who reject God go to hell, but then God continues to pursue them and continues to save people out of hell. And eventually, many universalists believe that all people will be saved out of hell. So maybe after 1,000,000 years, Adolf Hitler will finally bow a knee to God and leave hell, and eventually hell will be empty. So universalism, eventually all will be saved, and they can be saved by being saved out of hell. The final view the final topic is heaven. We wanted to have our final topic be heaven rather than hell. It seems a better note to end on. Right? So the doctrine of heaven. How do we understand heaven? I've already said a couple things about this in this class, but we could say a couple of important things. The typical picture of heaven is very unlike earth, pearly gates, eternal worship service, is pretty inadequate, I think, for understanding what heaven is. A better picture, and I've kind of pointed to aspects of this throughout the class, is first and foremost, we are in the presence of God. The being you were created to be in relationship with. Removal of evil and pain, suffering. I don't know exactly what that'll all look like, but my knee won't hurt in the morning. That'll be really, I'm looking forward to that. A sense of satisfaction and belonging, like coming home, right? So we kind of, the way we talk about heaven, it's like this weird, otherly place. And I think when we go there, it'll be like, yes, everything's right. I think a great metaphor for this is the Garden of Eden, because Revelation 21, other passages refer to end times as being, there will be a new heaven and new earth. So the idea is everything will be remade the way it should have been, right? So I don't think heaven is out in some cloudy, ethereal realm out there. I think heaven is here the way it should have been. Right? And then lastly, in heaven, all earthly goods compatible with the glory of God, including reunion, right? So we'll certainly meet people that, our loved ones that have passed on already. Those relationships will be important, but they will just not be as important as our relationship with God, right? So everything that's good about, truly, authentically good about this life will continue in heaven. And of course, all of it will be amplified in its goodness by God's presence being there in all of that. So there we go. Closing on a positive note with the doctrine of heaven. All right. There we have it. I will give description or instructions about the final exam. Probably in an email, but I might actually do a video to lay those out as well.